All right, I have with me today McCall Jones, who is an academic journalist and a few other things. um, he specializes in international relations and foreign policy. Um, so before we really dive into some of these issues I wanted to get into today that we spoke on a bit, um, can you give us a little bit about your background, McCall, and some things that you've been involved in over the years? I know you've got a bit of a diverse background.
Yeah. It's been interesting, and I've deliberately tried to keep it interesting. I mean, I grew up in Boston,
Yeah.
and when my grandmother was watching me every evening, the evening news was on, so I was
Mm.
introduced to what the world looks like outside of my street and outside of my house.
Yeah.
And it sort of sparked my interest in what's going on internationally and
Right, right,
why.
right.
We lived next to a big seaport right down in South Boston, and I got to see lots of cars being brought in from Japan. So I was kind of
Mm.
introduced to international trade. So I got a really big picture going on that something really big and something massive was going on
Right.
out there somewhere. So that interest grew, and then I began to recognize the importance of politics, and then
Right.
economics, and then people, and then social movements, et cetera. When I was really young, Dr. King was assassinated, Malcolm X was
Wow.
assassinated. During that time, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and
Wow.
just prior to my being born, by basically almost exactly a year, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So I
Wow.
grew up in a very turbulent time.
For
So
sure.
when and then of course, I was coming into elementary school in I think 1969 was when I started first grade to age myself there.
Mm.
So there was, Vietnam was obviously going on, the civil rights movement was obviously going on, the women's movement was obviously going on, and then we had other things like the Patty Hearst kidnapping. So
Wow.
all of those things, really shaped my worldview in a lot of ways, and I think it culminated in 1972 during the Munich Olympics, when
Mm.
I literally got to watch that event unfold live for an entire week.
Wow.
And I was very young. I had no idea what was going on. I knew the Olympics were on. I just happened to know that there was sports on every night, not just on Saturdays.
Yeah.
And then there's this report and a guy in a mask overlooking a balcony.
Mm.
And as I got to hear that, as I got to listen to that,
Mm.
I was really quite amazed.
Wow.
And I got that this was not normal, that this was not okay. And I'm a child.
Right.
And I also realized that the sports world is not separate or distinct from the politics of the rest of the world. Because a few years later, it was
Mm.
Bob Costas who introduced me to apartheid in South Africa.
Wow.
And I'd literally, I mean, as astute as I thought I was, even as a young person, I had never heard
Mm.
of apartheid at all.
Right.
And then, as he described it, I was absolutely shocked.
Wow.
So I continue to be educated on the fact that there's more out there than I'm aware of,
Mm.
in my little corner of Dorchester, Massachusetts. So
Right.
I just kept studying, and that grew to be a perpetual student of economics, to be a perpetual student of international affairs.
Mm-hmm.
And I studied at I went to Washington in high school, and then in college to study U.S. foreign policy, and then that
Mm-hmm.
turned into a master's degree, which I studied in Ireland,
Wow.
which was very eye-opening because to grow up in a situation where you're living in the number one world power,
Right.
to then study through the lens of a nation that is certainly critical in world affairs historically, as I learned.
Yeah.
They do not necessarily purport themselves to be a quote unquote world power in that regard,
Yeah.
but they are aware of their influence. They are aware that they too occupy a very pivotal place on the planet.
Right.
Just certainly not the place that the United States occupies. So it was very
Right.
interesting to really listen to the perspective and learn from the perspective, to learn about what's actually going on
Mm.
in Northern Ireland. And it was also the place that I really got to really see how poorly the press had been communicating the conflict, the nature of the
Mm.
conflict in Northern Ireland for my entire childhood and growing up. And the more I dug, the more I also saw how the press so poorly portrayed the war in the Balkans as well.
Mm. Wow.
And that's when I began to really get a grasp of, we are not necessarily getting the whole story or accurate stories from
Right.
people, no matter who they are, that we would otherwise be suggested that we trust.
Mm.
And I just kept barking up all those trees,
Wow.
and that one tree led to two trees, led
Yeah.
to
A
multiple trees, led to an
forest.
entire forest.
Yeah.
And it was pretty amazing. And I'm very thankful for my training, my background, my
Mm-hmm.
curiosity, my interest, because many times I end up the minority, both
Mm,
literally and figuratively,
yeah.
in a conversation about politics. And
Yeah.
and I very often, and people really don't understand that and this is even when I tell them, so I'm not being facetious, that my understanding of things is in
Mm,
many cases firsthand. It's not, I didn't get it from the news. I've
right.
sat in the offices of lobbyists
Hmm.
and analysts and intelligence people and State Department officials, and have had face-to-face conversations with them about what was to
Hmm.
come. And in most cases, those things that we discussed have come true.
Hmm.
And but when I describe those things, people assume that, like most people, that I'm just sort of this armchair quarterback, that I haven't
Yeah.
actually gotten this information either firsthand or through research or what have you. So it's been an interesting road, and it's one
Hmm.
that I accepted that ultimately I'd be, an iconoclast of sorts growing up. I mean, I think listening to the Bobby Kennedys and the John F. Kennedys and the Dr. Kings and the Malcolm
Hmm.
X's, I really got that there's some value here to being not part of the quote unquote mainstream. And so, and here we are,
Okay.
2021. Welcome to
There,
it.
there we are. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting background. Um, hmm, a lot of different directions that we can go there, but probably since you mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. and it's that day,
That day.
we should touch on it for a minute. And I wanted to kind of like mention a bit of a personal philosophy I have on that, which
Mhm.
is that he to me kind of represents this uh almost like a universal hero archetype. And the reason is because he is someone that I would put in the same category as like even the historical figure of Christ, even
Mhm.
Nelson Mandela, Socrates, Gandhi. Um, to some degree, there's this modern young lady, Yeonmi Park, who escaped North Korea. But in that, what they did is they had threats of violence to potentially even lose their own life,
Mhm.
and they could either choose to back down or potentially even fight with violence. But in choosing nonviolence is what led to the to greater or lesser degree in each case, um, the revolutions that would come after. And then in a lot of those cases, they faced exile, jail, and death in different cases. And then what I guess is sort of like the next level of that archetype, you might say, is that people then have the responsibility to pick up that mantle or that burden
Mhm.
and haven't always done so well at modeling that same what do you call it, the behavior pattern, and mainly in the area of nonviolence. And I
Mhm.
mentioned that because the day that we're in now, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, also uh, 2021, where particular, I've seen a lot of these ads on TV, especially watching sports recently, where they're like trying to merge like BLM and MLK are the same thing, but I'm sure you can shed more light onto it than I can, how that they are not, specifically in that he was a hero in championing nonviolence,
Mhm.
and the BLM movement has been the opposite up until a couple weeks ago, when they're like, oh look, violence is bad because the other side did it some.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
100%.
yeah, I'm wondering what your take is on that.
Well, where would you like me to start, with Dr. King or with BLM?
Huh, we'll start with Dr. King, since it's
Okay.
that day, and then
Perfect.
I guess how that they compare and contrast, or whatever the case.
Yeah. Dr. King is a very interesting case on a number of fronts. Not only because I got to, I mean, certainly not obviously because I got to sort of be at the tail end of that when I was coming into my own consciousness, but I got to see
Right.
the neighborhoods that he affected. I got to live in the same city where he got his doctorate degree in
Oh yeah.
Boston,
Yeah.
and he went to Boston University.
Right.
Um, I believe that his particular view
Hmm.
of American society was nothing short of genius,
Yeah.
because he recognized that the very principles that he was fighting for were already enshrined in the Constitution.
Right. Right.
What he recognized in his speeches and his thinking, obviously, and delivered them through his speeches, was that the tenets and the principles that he was pursuing were already the tenets and principles that the country itself, through its documents, through its ideas, through its founding, through its founders, had already stated, had already clarified, delineated and specified via the Constitution, right?
Right.
So his demand, if you will, if ever he made anything even close to a demand, his demand was that we live up to the principles that we had already enshrined in the principles of the founding of the nation.
Right.
So in other words, he wasn't asking for any kind of change
Right.
per se, right, from the existing rules or even existing policies yes, existing policies. But he was stating explicitly that the United States needs to live up to the principles that it has already declared for itself.
Right.
And that, to him, the possibility of that was what he was striving toward. He aspired for an America that actually lived up to its own values.
And that would, by the way, include, and this isn't necessarily a quote or paraphrase, but in the spirit of that, I guess, is it includes everyone. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused, is they want to be so divisive in like, oh, that's for this group or that group, or more for this group or more for that group, or something like that. But that means all groups and all people are not perfect, and we have failed at times presently and in our heritage and our past. But in spite of that, every single person, every single group can strive toward higher values. And so that would include majorities, minorities, and everything in between. And I think that's a natural sort of principle that we see, in that at some point we realize, when we like come to consciousness, is that everyone is fallible, but we can all strive for higher principles. So to your point, I think that's what he was after. Yeah.
I agree. That is exactly what I was getting at. That's exactly what I saw his pursuit as. And to that end, he was able to, just as you said, to peaceably actually achieve those ends.
Right.
There was a consequence, obviously, to him approaching the achievement of those ends.
Right.
There was obviously a force that did not want to see him achieve those things. And I think that who and what that force actually is actually very telling and very indicative of the nature of the society and the world in which we live. So he set out to alter the course of relations and how this country runs.
Right.
And he succeeded.
Yeah. Well, and he succeeded. And again, the reason I mention that is because, one, I don't think he would have had the success that he had, which was amazing success, for especially being only a few years that he had that opportunity, especially dying pretty young, not even 40 years old.
I think it's 34, 35 or something in that range.
Yeah. So he accomplished a lot, but those who kind of picked up the mantle after him, unfortunately, they had, I'm sure, good intentions, but because a lot of them sought after violence and race wars and divisiveness, and it was soon after that we got into started going on this path of intersectionality and all these other things.
Right.
It's just unfortunate the way that was picked up. But go ahead.
I'll jump in there just to say that,
sure.
Here's where people start to throw things at me, and this is where they bring out the rotten tomatoes they've saved up. I don't believe that anyone picked up the mantle after he was removed. I think that there was a total vacuum of intellect, of leadership, of ideas, that has culminated in, or is culminating in, what we're observing today. I think he was removed, and I think it was clear to the people who removed him what the next step was going to be. I'm reasonably sure that they were crystal clear that there was not another intellectual heavyweight that was waiting in the wings to come out and resume his mantle. They had already gotten rid of him, and he was not necessarily in agreement. I mean, Malcolm X was probably the only contemporary that would be of that ilk.
Right.
I think that there were other leaders at the time, but they weren't necessarily acting as civil rights leaders. I mean, I think the other profound voices would
Mhm.
include James Baldwin,
Yeah.
who was an absolutely brilliant thinker and orator, and he
Mhm.
carried the torch intellectually.
Mhm.
And also Muhammad Ali was
Right.
also another great orator and carrier of that flame.
Right.
But ultimately, as far as the other people that marched with Dr. King,
Right.
among them Jesse Jackson and many others,
Right.
I've never seen them as intellectual peers of Dr. King.
Mhm.
And they have objectively demonstrated that they are
Right.
not intellectual peers or even ethical.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, a lot of them I think had good intentions, but they would get sucked up in sort of like the group think or group mentality. And then
Mhm,
also what made Dr. King such that hero archetype, like I said, is
mhm,
that he was able to stand in the threat of violence. It was very early
mhm,
in his um history in the movement where he was receiving death threats, and most
mhm,
people would back down or answer with other violence or whatever the case. But he had his principles of nonviolence,
mhm.
and there was no one else, yeah, intellectually, but also just who would hold those principles to say, we're going to answer violence with nonviolence
Mhm.
and stand up for our principles and push for true equality. Because I think and maybe this kind of starts to get into the transition between then and BLM, but the temptation that so many fell into since then is just that it's they say equality, but what they want to do is crush who they say were in power and put new things in power,
Mhm.
which of course is not equality at all. It's just a new form of inequality or attempted
Right,
inequality.
right.
So
I mean, actual equality is anathema to
yeah.
progressives,
Yeah.
because then that would require competence, it would require training, it would
Right.
require qualifications, it would require being tested and passing those tests. It requires standards,
Right.
and the inclusion of standards to them is a bad thing. And
Yeah.
it is the opposite of everything that they represent. So as a result, once Dr. King was removed, it literally opened the doors to what we have now, because
Hmm.
what he was really promoting was in effect genuine equality.
Yeah, because it was like a spirit of equality that we're going to love each other no matter what. But in that being the case, just like in a family or
Mhm.
in a community or in a business or any organization of people, if you have that spirit of everyone tries to give each other a fair shot, then things will then you could say that ships will fall where they may, but also that people are going to have to work to become more equal if they're unequal.
Mhm. Mhm.
And there's going to be all kinds of things going on there. So he would preach for the sort of spirit of equality, but you can't force the actual equality, or that forces a new form of inequality.
Well,
uh,
correct. That's you. I think you've hit an absolutely crucial point.
yeah.
Is that the interaction around equality must be voluntary.
Right. Right.
This is why capitalism works, because at the end of the
Right.
day, our interactions are voluntary.
Right. Right.
And one of the reasons that we know that authoritarian regimes fail in the long run is that because all behaviors are compulsory.
Right.
And when you are forced to behave to a standard or avoid a standard, when you're forced to into who you associate with and who you avoid, over time, the human
Mhm.
psyche just breaks down. Yes, we can become automatons for a while, but then the human nature kicks back in, and then we want to fight for actual justice.
Right. Right. Right.
And that's why the crackdowns are necessary. That's why isolating people are necessary, because
Right.
people get a taste of freedom, they're going to bite, and they're not going to come
Mhm.
back. Which I guess gets us up to BLM,
Yeah. Which,
whereupon.
by the way, normally I think a year ago or any other year, we could
Mhm,
just celebrate Dr. King,
right.
but this is a special year where things are getting confusing to say that a violent group
Mhm.
that that calls themselves trained Marxist is not the same thing as Dr. King and what he represented. But yeah, go ahead with your BLM take.
Well, I think it's very telling
Yeah.
that Dr. King is not first and foremost in the headlines on his birthday, which is also a national holiday.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, it's actually quite far from,
Right.
being number one in the headlines. I mean, there'll be a mention of it. Someone wished me a happy MLK Day today,
Yeah.
but it is the farthest idea from the news. And I really do believe that that's not an accident.
Hmm.
So as it relates to BLM, there's an interesting sort of history of BLM, and that BLM and Black Lives Matter are not the same group. It's actually two distinct groups. And what's interesting is that, I mean, I was one of the first to sort of realize this, and most people are, continuing to be unaware of this. So they're
I
thinking
wasn't
that,
aware.
oh, see, there you go.
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter, of course, was originally started as a movement to really end police killings of unarmed Black, largely men, but certainly Black women as well, because
Yeah. I think
they were
everyone can get behind that.
and everyone could indeed get behind that.
Yeah.
But then along came another organization that was BLM. And BLM was ultimately a separate and distinct organization that ultimately borrowed the name from Black Lives Matter. And ironically, or not ironically, they very quickly usurped the footprint in the social fabric, let's just say. They are a for-profit organization. If you go to their website, you will notice that the funding, if you ever donate to them, does not go directly to BLM. It goes through a quote unquote nonprofit funding organization. So for me, that was a clue. I was one of the early people who went to their about page and just said, so what is BLM actually about? Now, of course, they still call themselves Black Lives Matter, but go publicly by BLM. Well, one of the things that I noticed several things about BLM that were very interesting. That number one, they were overtly anti-male.
Yeah.
They were explicitly anti-capitalist.
Right.
They were anti-traditional family.
Yeah.
And they were certainly, obviously, anti-American by a long stretch. And they were mostly explicit about it, and some things were implied. Like, so, for example,
which by the way, those are all very Dr. King values. He was very much pushing for family values, and
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's why when I said earlier that Dr. King's values are the antithesis of progressives,
right.
Now we're getting into what I actually meant, because you're absolutely correct. He was very pro-family, very pro-capitalism. And, most people don't even know that Dr. King was a solid gold Rolex wearing Republican.
Yeah.
And people try to sort of mask or really deny that, or hide that fact from reality. But I think that's very telling that in a time of a country run by Democrats, in a time that was ultimately handed over to Democrats, meaning the social fabric with the Great Society policy from President Johnson, that Dr. King was ultimately a Republican. So there's that component.
Yeah.
So not long after, people actually started to get wind of BLM's about page. That page actually disappeared. So if you go there now, I believe that page, it's like, oh, it's under construction. It's not there. I haven't been in a while, but it's just blatantly not there. And my conclusion from all this is that BLM's number one export, or at least their number one product, is revisionist history.
Yeah.
Because you cannot name a Black person that they've helped. You cannot name a Black life that they've saved. You cannot name a hungry family that they've fed. You cannot name a homeless family or person that they've housed. You cannot say that they've saved a single life in the inner city of Chicago on the South Side, or Roxbury, Dorchester, for that matter, or Baltimore.
I mean,
so
well, just like we mentioned, everyone can get behind not killing unarmed people by police and those things. But what you just described, which is true that the BLM organization is, it sounds a lot more like a corrupt religious organization. And just
I wouldn't describe it in any lesser terms.
Yeah.
I mean, the only Black lives that matter to Black Lives Matter, if you notice, if you name the people that you know of that Black Lives Matter supports, every last one of them is dead.
Right.
No. There's not a single living person that Black Lives Matter has promoted or attempted to save. Not one.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, and that's all that comes to mind is a corrupt religious organization, and nothing. I mean, there's good and negative in every type of organization, including religious. And so I don't mean to put them down or anything, but I mean, you could call it like a corrupt business, a corrupt government. At some point, things can start off with great ideas and good intentions, probably,
Mhm.
but at some point they become corrupt by certain ideology and ideological
Mhm.
possession, even.
Right.
And it
And
seems that's what
this
happened.
is, and in my view, this is where our actual conversation begins, right?
Right.
Because you'll notice that it was downplayed, of course, when it was initially stated. But to me, a student of history, to me, a student of economics, and a student of political structures, the second that someone mentions somewhere in
Mhm.
their existence that Marxism,
Right.
that basically tells me an entire story. And
Right.
then people will say, "Oh, but you don't know that person. You don't know the organization." Well, I do know Marxism, and I
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
understand the premises of Marxism, and I do know what its aims are.
Right. Right.
And once you understand that, you can begin to understand that it's going to be anti-personal property,
Yeah.
anti-family, anti-capitalism, anti
Anti-individual.
well, I was going down the list, but
Yeah. Yeah.
ultimately anti-individual,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's for very, very specific reasons.
Yeah.
And I also know that it is the long march has come home to roost, so to
Mhm.
speak, because the true influences of where we are now started with the postmodernist movement back in the early 1900s,
Right.
when postmodernism did not take hold in Eastern Europe, where it still has not even come close to taking hold. In fact, one of the most vehement resistance to the Soviet occupation was in Eastern Europe. Uh, and it simply didn't take hold. The class warfare that was being promoted
Mhm.
at the time, simply the people never bought it, because when the wars were being fought, the people that were going to war were fighting the rich people, the
Mhm.
royalty, the nobility was fighting those wars alongside the impoverished and the
Right.
serfs and the people of low status and low means. So the class war dynamic
Yeah.
of their argument simply didn't take hold.
Yeah.
So they packed up their bags, they moved to sunny Santa Monica and said, "How the heck can we destroy,
Mm.
America?"
Mm.
And they saw that the class warfare dynamic was not going to take hold here either.
Right.
So they looked to see what dynamics of American society could they exploit for their benefit. And ultimately, yes, you guessed it, they began to see that there is a dynamic within gender, that there was
Yeah.
an inherent conflict.
Intersectionality.
Well, we'll get to that, because
Okay.
intersectionality is ultimately a sort of is a byproduct of
Right.
the mechanism, right?
Right. Right.
And of course, the racial divides that existed in the United
Right.
States. Now, we'll ignore, for the moment, that the fate and livelihoods and the ability to make a living among Black people in the
Mhm.
20s, 30s, and 40s was much better than we are led to believe now.
Mhm.
First off, everybody's life, for the most part, was pretty dire back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Yeah. The
There
Depression
was this,
times.
well, correct. Well, just prior to Depression, because
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was the roaring 20s, right?
Right. Right. Right.
And as such, there was a small segment of the population that was able to benefit from all those investments that they were the get rich quickers.
Mhm.
But that was still a very small portion of the society. The majority of the society was still struggling. And it didn't matter what color you were, and it didn't matter what gender you were.
Right.
Most people ended up working. Most people had a hard life. That
Right.
was just kind of the way to go. And that included everybody, including Black people, right? So,
Right.
which we know, but it included all races that were living here at the
Right.
time. So there was no shortage of misery in poverty and suffering as
Right.
it
Right.
relates to American society. So the postmodernists in wonderful sunny, 26th Street, if I'm not mistaken, they were right there, right at 26th and I believe Montana, I want to say,
Mhm.
in that neighborhood, which is still a very nice neighborhood.
Mhm.
So to want to come to such a neighborhood in
Yeah.
a new country and say, "Hey, my goal is to basically debase and destroy
Mhm.
this country," is to me a very telling, state of the people that were willing to do this. And if
Right.
we look at the temperaments of people that now proclaim themselves to be Marxists and the BLM folks,
Mhm.
they're not the happiest of people.
Yeah.
In fact, the only time that I see them smiling is when cars are burning and people are dying
Yeah.
in the streets.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's pretty telling. So there's that dynamic. So they recognize that yes, they could exploit gender, yes, that they could exploit race, but where would they be able to get a foothold in society? And they recognize that the American liberal academic institutions and
Right.
the actual definition of liberalism back in the day was that all ideas are welcome, all
Right.
concepts are welcome, all challenges are welcome to this table, so that we can debate them and really argue through their merits, because the prevailing attitude coming out of even the beginning of the industrial age was knowledge for knowledge's sake,
Right.
knowledge for progress. Knowledge was really the route to progress, because that led certainly to industrialization. It also led, of course, to massive devastation. But overall, society's got to grow and prosper under
Right.
under this idea of knowledge and expanding the knowledge base. So under that premise, they snuck
Hmm.
into American universities,
Hmm.
University of San Diego, I
Hmm.
believe, University of Chicago, also NYU at the time, and I believe also Columbia, and most likely a few other universities. But they got into the key universities and they began to eke away at the stronghold of traditional Western, if you will, philosophy. They got to question it. They got to
Hmm.
introduce ideas such as, well, is reality real? Is anything real? Does yes really mean yes, or can
Hmm.
yes really mean no? So that they really start to invert and really sort of chew at the integrity of words and ideas. In other words,
Yeah.
2 + 2 being 4 is no longer an unquestionable concept.
Well, because I think what that's really getting at is the supremacy of language,
Mhm,
and that, and just like I said, we're all fallible people, all imperfect,
mhm.
but at some point we realize there are sort of supreme values, and with that, the one that I think people struggle with maybe the most is um, truth that comes from language.
Mhm.
And what that kind of thinking does is it provides an escape from having to go through the painful process of coming to truth through language and critical thinking, because coming to real understanding of truth and the way the world is a mentally straining process, especially
Mhm.
for a younger person, or
For anybody, it never
well,
goes
for
away. It doesn't get any easier.
yeah, for anybody. But it, I guess you might call it like an awakening, as that you have put in a certain amount of work to overcome the ideologies and the dogma, and sort of like the easy routes out, which the easy route are all like everything's the fault of power and capitalism and racism and all that. It's just it wanted such an easy thing to be like, yeah, those things I can see how they're bad, so let's protest it. But it takes another level of just a whole conversation, which those conversations are hard, because sometimes it can be like, oh, if I say I'm not sure about that, then people are going to think maybe I'm racist or I support destroying poor people or something, you know. So there are hard conversations to have, but it does get you it's almost like you build up strength the more you go through. It doesn't necessarily get easier, but the individual that goes through the process gets stronger, and most people don't
Well, I
want to do that.
mean, that's exactly right. I mean, most people want to take the literally the easy way out,
Right,
or the
right.
easiest way out.
Yeah.
And you're right. Growth and development requires stress and strain and being uncomfortable.
Right.
And there's really, from a physics perspective, there's absolutely no way around it. I mean, a tree growing produces stress and strain, and ultimately
Right.
the tree grows. If we want to physically get stronger, we have to break down our muscles through stress and strain, and over time, our muscles get stronger. So
Right. Right.
it is a natural phenomenon,
Right.
and it is the attempt to violate such natural phenomenon that the Marxist principles exist.
Right.
They seek to avoid the dynamics of human nature. They seek
Right.
to avoid the natural evolutions of organization and
The
people.
only value I see in it, by the way, is that sometimes it's easy to talk about almost that how how these things have a negative effect, but the only advantage I see is it's almost like a worthy adversary. It's like something to go up against that makes a person stronger.
Mhm.
uh but each and that it's hard for that to really even come in movements, and probably even shouldn't. But as each individual decides to put in the mental work to overcome that adversary in the culture, then that person will be stronger than if there was no adversary. Like, even in, at least for me as a young person, kind of growing up in the late 80s, 90s, and last since then, um it all this stuff wasn't something to go up against up until the last 10 years or so. I mean, it was there, but it was like under the surface,
Mhm.
not doing a lot of damage. And it's only been in the last 10 or so years where it's really become this thing that is like assaulting our daily life, assaulting our businesses, assaulting um, our countries, our borders, our
Mhm.
economy, of course, and and like I said, our daily life, because uh, I think everybody nowadays can attest to at least one or a handful of relationships that were lost over conversations on this issue in the last year or so.
Well, absolutely. But I would again go to the more extreme position to say
Yeah,
that while they were not necessarily in the public eye,
yeah, yeah.
those forces, I'll just use that general term, were at
Sure.
work and they were doing a tremendous amount of damage. It just
Right,
wasn't quite so visible.
right, right, right.
So if you're thinking about, oh my goodness, academia, which even 10
Right.
years ago, statistics were demonstrating that the ratio of progressive professors to conservative professors was approximately 13 to 1,
Right.
a decade or more ago.
Hmm.
That largely history classes, for example, were eliminated from elementary and high schools.
Wow.
Civics classes were disappearing when I was in high school in the 80s.
Wow.
I'd wanted to take civics. By the time I had the chance to take it, it wasn't offered anymore.
Wow.
Only to discover years later that the removal of such programs that related to economics, that related to understanding how the country actually runs, were
Mhm.
systematically removed. Now, some people, now when I've mentioned this to people, they go, well, I had civics class and I went to school in the late 90s or the early 2000s or whenever it was. Yeah, I guess there were a few that still managed to sneak through. But for the most
Wow.
part, those programs were systematically eliminated.
Well, and in a lot of cases, replaced by a Marxist version, at least at the university level.
Well, please give me an example of that because I just know that they went away and other ideas
Oh,
came in, but I
well,
don't know about a Marxist version of civics.
I only say that because I know of at least a few videos that I've seen where there's openly Marxist professors,
Mhm.
and I would have to look into it as far as what that they normal the whole class, but they're teaching uh, a, a communist version of economics where basically the it's all about labor and how basically capitalism is destroying the world,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that is taught. I've seen a few examples of it in the university, and even if it's not always in the classes, like here's the communist version of economics and that's what we should do, there's
Mhm.
been there's been a lot of friends the last few years that would just ask me to help them with their homework, and
Mhm.
just in like normal, like early level college English homework,
Mhm.
so much of it is this like and like that's why I mentioned intersectionality stuff a
Mhm.
couple times, because so much of their just like English homework has to do with that same like, oh, here's a story about how this group is oppressing that group and that
Mhm.
group's oppressing that group, when it's like, yeah, if you want to have those debates and essays on that, cool. But it's like, when I was going to college, like in the early 2000s, if we were going to have some general essay to work on writing skills, it would just be something more general in the world, or maybe about general
Mhm.
history or general
Right.
day-to-day events. And now it's
Right.
so much of the homework and all the subjects now has just become this like how every group is being oppressed by every other group, and it's
Except one.
yeah.
So thank you for
Mm.
clarifying
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
I 100% agree. Those programs were basically eliminated and then replaced
mhm,
by the the ideological indoctrination that you just described.
Yeah.
I just thought that you were suggesting that there was like a one-to-one replacement where, here's
Yeah.
regular civics and now here's Marxism. But in the case of economics, I can completely agree.
Yeah.
For example, I explain to people, if you listen to Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and listen to her talk about economics, it's crystal clear that her background in economics is Marxist in nature.
Right.
Along the lines of a Robert Reich, for example. Crystal clear that those are Marxist, philosophical positions that they hold as it relates to economics, because the things that they say, a Keynesian economist would never necessarily agree. A Hayek economist, a von Mises economist, would never ever
would make them throw up, actually.
Well, yeah, or they'd certainly laugh really hard, and then they'd say, why what they're suggesting doesn't really work, and then we can get into the world of Thomas Sowell, for example, and similar people. Not that there are similar people, but you get the idea. That are going to sit there and say, look, Thomas Sowell, for example, has two advantages. One, he's lived through all these bad ideas. And number two, he's a genius. So you put two and two together and you get to watch, what's going on. As it relates to my background specifically, and why I hold the views that I do. Growing up in Dorchester in the 60s and the early 70s in the Dorchester section of Boston, I literally got to watch socialist program after socialist program after socialist program sweep through the neighborhoods, and things only got worse. There was at no point did anything ever get any better. And it was only until I saw more conservative politicians sweep into the city, many, in effect, decades later, did I see any type of improvement. Even something as nice as putting up new trees, I did not see happen until the socialist programs had been removed from the community. So I got to see it firsthand. In fact, most recently, there was a story about this pizza shop that had opened in Dudley Square. Dudley Square is a section of Roxbury that I, basically, if I rode the bus home, I would go through there basically every day. And if I was going downtown, I'd pass through there. So it's a place that I'm extremely personally familiar with. And it was pizza. So it's a pizza business. It's like beer. You don't even have to sell pizza.
Everyone can relate to pizza.
Everyone can relate to pizza. Speaking of cultural appropriation, but this pizza shop was opened at Dudley Square, and it was intended and conceived to be a Marxist philosophy pizza shop. So that meant people received a living wage. And they all received the same living wage, and they made and sold pizza. And it was heralded as a really solid move, because it's like, here's the chance for socialism to really spread its wings and demonstrate its efficacy in the real world. Well, lo and behold, it of course did completely demonstrate its efficacy in the real world, and it failed. They ran out of money because the salaries were too high. They didn't really do any marketing, and they didn't expect to. So basically, sales were very low. So and even with funding from many different organizations, I don't think BLM was on the list. Not ironically, but the owner of the New England Patriots was on that list. I think he provided them some $200,000 to keep them going. And at the end of the day, they had to shut down because their socialist model, completely broke down and failed. So, so to see a system be put in place, and then to see it fail, and then to see it fail consistently, really tells me that the people that really support socialism are completely incapable of learning from the past. And to further that, what I've observed among people that support socialism is that, number one, first and foremost, to qualify, you first and foremost have to have an absolute ignorance of economics. If you have even the slightest understanding of economics, you're not allowed to belong to the club, because then, I discovered that there's only basically, what was the phrase? Goodness gracious. I mean, I made it up and I have to think about it. How did I say? There's only two types of people. Two types of socialists. Two types of socialists: those who don't understand economics, and capitalists. Because to understand economics at all eliminates the ability for you to actually be a socialist, because you understand that socialism is not based on principles that have any chance of working in the real world. I am going to centrally plan that someone needs 10,000 bars of soap. Right? In a place that everyone lives on the coast and goes to the beach all the time. Well, guess what? We're not necessarily going to need quite that much soap. You know, it's those types of economic choices and decisions
Hmm.
that are the epitome of why ultimately socialism doesn't really work, is because a person believes that they have a better grasp on what the needs of a large audience of people
Right.
is actually going to be in need of. I mean, you know, to say that, I mean, who would have known that a giant SUV was going to become the number one selling vehicle in the United States in the 90s,
Hmm.
right after we supposedly had a major gas shortage? Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, they're still pumping out, you know, cars that barely fit two people and
Yeah.
could barely run, you know, 10 miles before they broke down. So
Right.
that was their idea of what the marketplace needed, when in fact the capitalist countries were producing Lamborghinis at the same time that Tremont was still being manufactured in East Germany.
Right.
So these are the types of you know, differences that we notice. And as we traveled around the world, somebody asked me the other day, well, what's an example of functioning Marxist economies or, you know, socialist economies on the planet? And I looked at them kind of like, really? That's a question? I mean, you're not aware of North Korea, you're not aware of Cuba, you're not aware
Yeah.
of China, you know, you're not aware currently of Venezuela, you
Yeah.
know, and the list kind of goes on. So again, the second tenet of being a
Yeah.
socialist is you have to despise history,
Right. Right.
because history tends to be very
Well,
inconvenient.
despise it and, like you said, rewrite it, because it's not enough to
Correct.
just not like it and ignore it.
Hmm.
And you see that in countries like you mentioned, the worst communist countries like North Korea. They
Like the
they
worst
com-
communists, there's a scale of them.
I don't know if there's a scale, but the maybe the most, North Korea, for example, they
Hmm.
completely rewrite their own history
Hmm.
uh, because truth would be unkind to them, especially for their agenda, and
Absolutely.
the same for any socialist movement.
Right. And revising history to me is a facet of despising history, because
Right.
you know, you hate something because it's problematic and therefore you get rid of that problem. You know, you're A-okay.
And
Right.
you,
So
yeah, replace it with a lie in a lot of cases.
exactly. That's
Yeah, yeah,
exactly right. So with whatever's, you know, convenient. So when I say
yeah.
that BLM's mode is their number one product is revising history,
Right,
that this is exactly what I'm getting at ultimately,
right, right,
because
right.
actual history tends to be extremely inconvenient for them. So their fundamental premise, for example, that
Hmm.
all white people are inherently and have historically been racist,
Yeah,
is completely not true. I
right.
happen to be a blood relative, a blood descendant of John Brown. And
Mm,
John Brown is the most famous abolitionist in American history. John Brown was part of a massive movement among white people to end slavery, because they
hmm.
saw it as not only an abomination, but it was absolutely a curse upon the United States as a
Right,
country, and actually ultimately threatened its survival, which
right.
from an economic standpoint, it actually did. And I'll get to that shortly.
Sure.
But he was not only passionate, but he's still probably singularly the single most committed and passionate person I have ever heard of.
Hmm.
Ethan Hawke stars in the TV show now. That's basically, he plays John Brown in this show
Hmm.
that's currently airing. And for the most part, I mean, and I haven't had a chance to see it, so I really can't comment on the show in terms of its accuracy or
Right.
in one way or another. But I can definitely say that John Brown's one mission in life was to end slavery.
Hmm.
And he, you know, he ran his own businesses. They went okay, but again, his core mission was to end slavery.
Right.
And he traveled the country working with various organizations, and even the underground that Harriet Tubman is famous for, you know, having people travel along.
Hmm.
But when he ultimately saw that slavery was not going to go anywhere on its own, he
Right.
began to take matters into his own hands. And he
Hmm.
recognized that since slavery is legal in the United States, he was going to then overthrow the federal government and
Yeah.
basically take over the government and then end slavery that way, since it was a
Mm.
sanctioned activity in the United States. So he decided to overrun and rob the armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia.
Oh.
Therefore, they'd have enough weapons to then overtake the federal government. Now,
Mm.
mind you, if you read, you know, for example, Howard Zinn, what you get is you recognize that the sovereignty, not the sovereignty, but the staying power, the ability for the federal government to defend itself during that time
Hmm.
wasn't terribly strong. So
Yeah,
their
not like now.
policy was Correct.
Yeah.
So their policy was to brutally suppress
Right.
anyone who did dare, rise up against the government directly, because
Right.
they knew that if it was really revealed that they didn't really have the staying power, it would obviously be problematic. So,
Right.
John Brown's plan worked in the morning,
Mhm.
but by the next day or so, most of his team and his brothers had been rounded up. They were arrested. They were given basically summary trials, found
Mhm.
guilty, and then executed right away for literally treason. So that's what treason looked like back in the day. I think it's
Mhm.
evolved a little bit since then.
Right.
So it's impossible for me to look at United States history
Mhm.
knowing that I'm related to an abolitionist,
Right.
and accept that there's any truth to the story, that all white people are inherently racist and all white people are inherently quote unquote supremacists. It's just absolutely
Yeah.
impossible. It's also impossible knowing that I was a family friend, was Edward Brooke, who was the first Black senator and a Republican
Mhm.
elected to the Senate since Black people were allowed back in the bar, since they
Mhm.
were ejected from the bar basically back, I believe it was sort of in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
And they weren't really allowed to return to national politics and the bar. The first person that arrived back was Ed Brooke in the 1960s.
Mhm.
So I think it's also telling that he was a Republican, but he was also a family friend.
Right.
So again, this is a piece of my first. Now, I never met him, of course. So
Mhm.
in that case, it becomes secondhand information, but it wasn't the media. My great aunt was very close friends with him.
Right.
My mom found a treasure trove of letters the two of them had back and forth. They were extremely close.
Mhm.
So as I look at American history, as I look at the role that my family has literally played in it,
Mhm.
it's impossible for me to see or believe that the oppression story, and again,
Mhm.
the intersectionality of it all, even
Right.
the dynamic of the oppression of women, it's impossible for me to accept those stories as flatly as they like to tell them. There's
Right.
enough truth to them for people to buy into it. But as you begin to dig into the history of things, you start to realize that those stories don't really hold up to actual history.
Yeah, and um, a couple things that you mentioned just brings to mind the other strange thing that's going on in our strange time. Uh, I guess two things are going on at once, which
The
is
other,
yeah. There's multiple things, but there's maybe a couple main ones. I guess that where it kind of culminated was with the so here's the strange thing is that BLM was all like, let's use violence for our ends, and Antifa, which is another whole other can of worms. But then when there was this march on the Capitol on the 6th of this month, the narrative suddenly changed to, oh my God, never use violence. Look at the horrible violent people. Why would anybody ever be violent? So there was this like change in the narrative on violence, and then it's strange because the I
I'd
could
offer, I would
go ahead.
offer that there was no change in the narrative on violence.
Okay, well,
Because if
yeah,
they go, if the left, if the
mm,
progressives went out and caused violence tomorrow,
right,
there'd be no pushback against it, right?
yeah. Well,
And
it's
the
yeah,
change that I'm referring to right now
mm,
is it was conservatives that were suggesting or slipping toward using violence, and there was a
mm,
massive outcry.
right,
Well, number one, the narrative on that didn't change because there was no real precedent for that
right,
to have happened.
right,
So the narrative on violence for them has not changed.
right,
Leftist progressive violence is
mm,
completely not only tolerated, but overtly encouraged by
right,
their political leaders. Right.
yeah,
So the only thing that changed was the dynamic of who was doing the
right,
violence.
right.
And the only thing, therefore, that the progressives are able to say is that, oh my goodness, violence is bad, but only because the other guys are doing it now.
Well, and what's strange about it too is this kind of gets into the other can of worms along with that, which is the whole thing with any society on a philosophical, psychological, just like our value roots is we have to have free speech, and especially since the 6th of this month, we've seen a big attack on that, especially in
Mhm.
big tech. We're reaching over platforms like
Mhm.
Facebook right now, and
Mhm.
um, it's really strange because first it was like censor and destroy anybody who had any right-leaning affiliation. And the biggest surprise to me that just seems like shouldn't have been possible at all was the whole like Parler was whatever it was put on freeze because not and it's strange because it was put on freeze by Amazon Web Services. So
And
all
Apple.
yeah, so all those who
Oh, I'm
thought
sorry, the survey, correct. Yeah, the Amazon Web Services is a server set, and they
yeah.
also pulled it off of the Amazon store as well as the Apple Store. So sorry, get going.
Yeah. So basically it's like when we're thinking, okay, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and these are not going to give us free speech, so we'll go find an alternative. Parler, for example, they say, screw you. Um, basically, one ideology, one partisan, leaning left, whatever you want to call it, is completely has the right buttons to push. So you're only allowed to think and operate and communicate the way that we like. So here you go. Here's a display of our power. We'll just
Correct.
yeah. So like I said, that's a whole lot there. One on free speech and what we can do with that, and then the whole attack on the Capitol is a whole other tricky thing.
Well, I'd said for years that even though George Orwell spoke about Big Brother, what I observed is that there were big brothers.
Right.
That the mechanism of Big Brother was actually held by a wide variety of operators. That it wasn't just a centralized, or shall I say, it wasn't as centralized as Orwell had written, and certainly, both literally and metaphorically, he still nailed it, quite accurately.
You're right, but it's more of like a ideology than anything.
Well, that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
that's exactly what I'm getting at.
So go ahead.
That people's belief that if you walk into a crowd of people and say, oh, Marxism runs the United States, their retort, and the only retort that I've heard is that, well, it's not the government that's totalitarian, so therefore we don't live in a Marxist socialist society. And I strongly and vehemently beg to differ with that, because the assumption that they have is that, even if you look at their sort of Wikipedia definition, is that the totalitarian or socialist or Marxist infrastructure must be, by their definition, must be the state, right? So if it is anything less than the state, they do not recognize it as the Marxist principles, which is what you're getting at, are in play. Now, anybody who's honest can see crystal clear that those mechanisms are in play, and that they dominate the institutions, and that they ultimately dominate what those institutions create, which is the businesses that then those students of that totalitarian educational system go into and start. So it's no surprise that all of the movements of these large web organizations are left-leaning, because these kids, for the most part, they are kids, have had, just as you described, their entire academic education has been entirely focused on capitalism is bad, that Marxism is really the way to go, that the capitalists do not care about the poor or downtrodden, which factually that ultimately is completely untrue. And the inverse actually is entirely true and provable. But they grow up believing these things, and now they're in charge. And they're in charge of the institutions, even though these institutions were started from scratch as private enterprises. But ultimately, we recognize them as the Marxist-driven, or the Marxist ideologically driven institutions that they actually are, even though they are, in fact, supported by capitalism.
Well, and what's really, I don't know if I'd say scary,
actually,
but
I'm sorry, I take it back. I will even argue that they're not supported by capitalism, but carry on.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say what's, I guess, really scary on a deeper level in a way is that, like, sometimes when we're having this, there's this conversation, this idea about like big tech controlling or manipulating or influencing the elections, it was kind of like, well, I don't know about that. But now that it's
I do, as a matter of fact.
Well, yeah, but now that it's come to fruition, that however that we've seen certain people come to power, and that is a whole other podcast in itself, as far as these last elections and how much and why that they went the way that they did. But definitely big tech had an influence on that, and we know that by a lot of polling data and everything else. And so now they have become more powerful than anything capitalistic at all. Because before, the sort of like mantra was like, hey, we can own this and that politician because we fund their campaign. Now they are the campaign. Big tech
Mhm.
is the campaign for the left, because
Mhm.
because they can pick and choose who's going to win each election now, and they're proud of it. Like
Mhm.
before, it would be something that you would want to you'd want to play down or keep secret, but now they are proud that they can pick the winner of just about any election.
Mhm.
And not and that's really what took it to like a mind-blowing level to me, when it's not just like um they're going to aggregate data in a certain way between Google, Facebook, Twitter, and them, but even then, now Amazon's in it to saying, oh, you want an alternate platform? Not
Mhm.
no, we don't think so.
Well,
And it is ideological too, because it's from every level, from like friends losing friendships all the way up
mhm.
to picking presidents. So yeah, and that's why, like, when you saw, when I kind of made the announcement of this a couple hours ago, I was like, what is the responsibility of the individual in these historic times? And I guess that's really what we're getting at. It's really strange times to be in. And what do we do with this responsibility?
Well, I mean, in the vein of Jordan Peterson, in the vein
Sure.
of Stefan Molyneux,
Hmm.
we are really obligated to learn the truth.
Right, right, right,
And the truth will literally, in that regard, even Dr. King for that matter, the truth shall in fact set us free. Because
right,
this all began because we were separated from the truth. We were
right.
separated from the truth of our history. We are
Hmm.
separated from the truth of our economics. We are separated from the truth of the nature of violence. We're separated from the truth of the nature of who rules us. We're separated from the truth of who we are as individuals.
Hmm.
So the farther and farther we get away from what is true,
Hmm.
the easier we become to manipulate, the easier we become to literally be led astray or be led where someone wants us to go.
Right,
The more we are able to be susceptible to being controlled by whoever literally shows up.
right.
And as it relates to what I just said before, that I misspoke and said that these companies were capitalist in nature, but the reality is these companies are all Marxist totalitarian in nature. Because think of it,
Yeah.
even take our host right now,
They're
Facebook.
power mongers is what it is.
Well, I'll ultimately get to that
Okay.
end of the story, but we
Sure.
start off here. If we take a Google, for
Hmm.
example,
Sure.
and if we take Facebook, as another example,
Sure.
I'm leaving Apple out for very specific reasons for the moment, because they are
Yeah.
largely supported as a commercial enterprise. Everything that you do with Apple is for pay.
Yeah.
But as it relates to Google and Facebook, us as consumers are able
Hmm.
to access that information for free, right? So our ability
Free is a
to,
funny word, isn't it?
free indeed is a funny word, but
Yeah.
as it relates specifically to capitalism, there
Right,
is
right.
no cost. We do not have to pay money to access Facebook or Google, right?
Yeah, we pay with our attention, which is
Correct.
actually more valuable than money, but go ahead.
Well, indeed it is. Indeed it is. And ultimately, I'm getting there. So, from
Yeah.
a capitalistic standpoint, where the only criteria is someone pays for a physical or technical thing with
Right.
money, that exchange does not happen, right? So, the
Hmm.
contract that would exist from a legal and ethical standpoint for someone who gives their money in exchange for a product or service does not exist. So
Right.
they're not obliged to comply to any type of contract whereupon, if we paid for it, they'd be obliged to support and
Right.
reciprocate
Instead,
through.
what these companies are doing is buying and selling our attention, our eyeballs.
Yes, but the big point is to who, and I'm
Right.
marching down that road.
Sure, sure.
So what we have is a socialistic relationship with these companies. In other words, these companies are fundamentally large enough and influential enough to call them a state entity. They have a global reach. They
Yeah.
obviously have a tremendous impact on who we and what we are nationally here in the United States. So they basically have the power on par of a national government. They
No,
have policies. They say
they're
who can.
more powerful than most governments, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm building that case.
Okay, okay, go
I'm
ahead.
building that case because I don't
Yeah,
want
go
to
ahead.
simply go to that we're totally under their thumb
Yeah,
without
yeah,
building
yeah,
the case toward it.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
but I do agree with you ultimately that they ultimately wield much more power than. But I will also argue that there is a limit to their power for this reason. Number one, their number one customer in both cases, in terms of Amazon, in terms of Google, and in terms of Facebook, their number one customer is the federal government.
Yeah.
So something like 80 or 90% of Facebook's revenue is the federal government.
Right.
Amazon's largest enterprise is their encrypted server infrastructure that is ultimately used by the NSA and other government entities. So as it relates to their ultimate power, I would argue that the federal government still has the supreme power over them, because they can just literally cut them off and go elsewhere and build their own infrastructure. They still have that power.
Right.
They obviously have the money to do so. So they are tremendously powerful, and the government uses them as a proxy for absolute sure. But I would hesitate to argue that they are in fact more powerful than
well,
the national government.
It's interwoven and codependent, almost like a I don't know if I'm jumping to make this analogy, but it's like a couple, a married couple or a boyfriend girlfriend that are codependently addicted to crack. And the crack in this instance would be ideology, and that's what they are pushing on us and selling to each other. So I don't know how well that analogy works, but it's just what comes to mind. That it's codependent and that they need each other.
Well, it's absolutely true. As far as the consumers are concerned,
right.
We need the people with the competing ideologies so that we can fight and yell at them. So we definitely need them. Right. The services, however, do not need us in that regard as individuals. They need us as a mass, but they do not need us as individuals. In fact, they prove every day how little they need us as individuals. They can just arbitrarily eliminate thousands of us and lose, what was it, $50 billion in valuation off of Facebook? I think it was like $50 billion in valuation based on the purging that happened last week. So yeah, I completely agree with you. So what I'm getting at is these institutions, which I will call them institutions, while though not official, still act as the proxy totalitarian regimes that are a proxy for the federal government. So the federal government does not have to officially become a totalitarian enterprise. So they're able to have them be totalitarian on their behalf. And that's what that ends up looking like. And then we get sucked in and trapped. And then in a sense, we can't really leave. And which is another dynamic of a totalitarian regime, when they don't actually allow you to leave. Because if you think about it, people that wanted to leave Facebook were prevented when Parler was removed. How not totalitarian was that move?
It's scary.
Yeah. So for me, I hear people be scared all day long, but I have read history, I understand history, I understand where this is headed and what it looks like, and it's potentially going to get really, really bad.
Right.
But at the same time, I think that, again, getting back to what is true, and what is real, is ultimately probably the most crucial dynamic that will help us, recover at the other end of it. And I believe it's going to be hard, and I believe it's going to be hard for a long time. I mean, people are happy that Biden is going to be inaugurated, and no, I'm sorry, I take it back. They don't care about Biden. What they care about is that they're happy that Trump isn't going to be continuing on for a second term, which is very different from desiring Biden.
Well, the only thing that Biden serves for them is that he's like nobody even has any idea what Biden believes or thinks or anything like that. I don't even think he knows. That's why he can barely talk. He doesn't know what he believes. And one of the times that he was asked about it is oh, what if you and your vice president have a fundamental disagreement on foreign policy or something? He's like, I'll get some kind of a disease and have to resign. It's like, and she's kind of looking at him like, dude, you're not supposed to say that. But I think that's a fundamental sign that he's just this, he's like a mascot for the ideology and the movement, and and nobody good.
And there's and I completely agree with you. And I think that many people misunderstand which movement he's actually a mascot for.
Yeah, because he doesn't even know.
Certainly he doesn't know, but his handlers do. And and he does not represent progressive values by any stretch of the imagination. They are and can be a vehicle in terms of what runs defense for him. But at the end of the day, he has installed the entirety of the Obama administration's infrastructure. And these are in effect, neocons that have returned to the administration.
Mhm.
These are the same people that had orchestrated and architected the Arab Spring uprising.
Right.
When you look at his pick for Secretary of State, Antony Blinken,
Mhm.
Blinken was under Secretary of State during Obama, and
Right.
he was one of the architects of the Arab Spring as directed by Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
So now, as Secretary of State, and if you look at, he was on French TV describing that he is completely pro-regime change by
Yeah.
quote unquote any means necessary.
Which is
He's
what
made
I'm
it
sure
quite,
we'll see over the next few years.
I suspect that we will be at war before the year's out.
Yeah, maybe before the month's out. We'll see.
Right, exactly. I believe it's going to be as it's going to be, in my view, as immediate as they can produce it.
Right.
In other words, if it takes a month, if it takes 6 months, however long it takes for them to get the machine in place,
Yeah.
we'll be back at war.
Yeah.
And most likely it'll be the Middle East. And soon after
Yeah.
that, it'll be somewhere in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
I just observed that. I've observed, for example, now that it's clear that Biden is going to be sworn in, I've seen gas prices here in parts of Los Angeles
Yeah.
rise by $1 over
Yeah.
the past week. So within 7 days, it's already gone up $1, which is,
Yeah.
is a significant jump looking at precedent, number one. So why might that be? Well, first and foremost, I mean, Biden has sworn that he's going to eliminate fossil fuels in the United States within the next 5 to 10 years.
And of course, he's
Well,
going
what
to
does
be
that
raising
mean?
all taxes he can.
Well, of course.
Yeah,
So that means he wants to eliminate fossil fuel burning vehicles. So that's
Right.
going to be all electric cars. Now, to a great degree, there's an irony to that in the sense that yes, it eliminates petrol, but it doesn't eliminate coal, because
Right.
very few people recognize that something like 80 to 90% of our electricity is generated through coal burning power plants.
Right.
So that's
And that's
just one
what
of those-
charges the electric cars.
Exactly, ultimately.
Yeah.
So they go to the power plants, plug it into the wall. The electricity comes from the power plant,
Mhm.
which is fueled by coal. But people don't really look that deeply into how things
Yeah.
operate.
I think we have to go in a few minutes, but one thing I wanted to touch on a little bit before we do is, again, what happened on the Capitol Hill, the nation's capital, on the 6th, and it kind of gets into what we've been talking about the last few minutes, was how there's all this narrative and ideology going on about it, and it kind of reminds me of this argument of how, and again, I'm not taking a place on at least today on religion or Christianity, but it almost reminds me of how, like, people in that debate, they'll say, like, oh, look, the Christians slaughtered people in the Middle Ages, and then sometimes to that they'll say, oh, but look, these atheist groups, like Mao and Stalin, they slaughtered people in the 20th century. But then the sort of like proper retort in both of those cases is like, that didn't represent the Christians or the atheists. It was people who kind of went overboard in extreme in their ideology and whatever else. So likewise, I think we're kind of going through that on the issue with our what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, was that we've been trying to figure out what happened and who's responsible, and we're only allowed via the media and big tech to have one narrative in mind, which is that it's all the president's doing, essentially, and it's all Trump supporters doing, where that may be true to a certain extent, but not to the extent, at least, that it represents the bulk of Trump supporters or what the president's ideals were. So it's more of this twisted, forced ideology that we have to think a certain way, where really the responsible thing to do for every individual and the nation and the world is to, when we go through those situations, just like anything else, when we had 9/11, when we had any other attack or anything like that, it's like, let's figure out what's going on with these. And it's strange too. And I mean, you have experience as a journalist. As a journalist, traditionally, you're not supposed to come out and say right away, almost like, innocent until proven guilty. You're not supposed to come out right away and say who the responsible agents were until that has been unequivocally proven. But through the whole media and big tech, it's just been Trump supporters are trying to take over the nation through violence on the Capitol, when that's not exactly how it went down. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Louis Gohmert was stating, I think last night or I believe this morning, that this event happening on the 6th, and
Yeah.
basically by the 8th, they're moving to impeachment,
Right.
is an overt denial of due process, just as
Right.
you're
Right. Right.
suggesting, that we don't even know the facts of the situation, and we're already moving to remove a president that has, 48 hours left to go, in his term, number one.
Right.
But I mean, I think fundamentally that the attack on the Capitol was an absolute mistake.
Right.
But on the other hand, I really have no patience for the people who are unclear about what drove it to happen in the first
Right.
place. Because, in my view, it's been 4 years in the making,
Right.
with an entire constituency being ignored, vilified, name called,
Right.
belittled,
Right.
called Nazis, called racists, called supremacists, told that they don't care, told that they are indifferent, told that they, want the destruction and death of people who are not them.
Right.
People are disgusted, and I believe that they're legitimately disgusted by
Yeah.
having been beaten on and beaten down for the past ultimately 4
Well,
years.
and on that same note, it's just the other question that maybe we don't have time to get into, but can just touch on for today is what are we supposed all like the ones who I mean, there were maybe some extreme radicals and bad actors and just frustrated people
Mhm.
of all kinds in that situation. And of course, you and I and almost everyone don't support violence in that case. But um, what should be the response? Because those who were acting, they're acting out of that frustration that you just mentioned, but also just out of the frustration that they believe we're moving into a paradigm where our vote no longer matters because so
Mhm.
many people believe that. And it's not just the fact that maybe the election was stolen, but it's the fact that we can't contest it, we can't investigate it, we can't
Correct.
talk about it.
Correct.
And
And that was where the
what do we do at
frustration
that
lived.
point? Yeah, go ahead.
Right. That's where the frustration lived, because these people, the argument is that these people are trying to overthrow the government and
Right.
reverse the results of the election. But in my view, these people are upset because there was a question. And
Mhm.
that single question turned into many questions. And that those many questions turned into many questions in multiple states.
Right. And we're not even allowed to
And
discuss it.
correct. And everyone was really calm and quiet while the investigations seemed to be mounting.
Right, right.
But as the lower courts dismissed the cases, in
Not
the
on their
case for
merits.
not on their merits, as for example, Nevada said, okay,
Mm,
those 25 books of evidence you presented, man, it's immaterial. I'm not gonna look at it. So
right,
when those cases were just summarily dismissed for questionable reasons, let's
right,
say, with each one of those being knocked down, the ire and pressure, went up on people that were beginning to see that there was a consistency to the activity to deny them the right, really the investigation.
right.
I do not perceive, and nor do I believe, that the issue was about resisting the results. The issue was resisting the route to those results,
Hmm.
because we indeed just wanted, quote unquote, free and fair elections, only to
Right, right, right,
discover that neither was the case.
right,
And that was the issue. And
right.
to have it be summarily dismissed, to hear John Roberts openly say, openly to his colleagues in a secretly recorded, conversation,
Yeah.
that he doesn't want to take on the case for fear of riots, does not suggest that that is an impartial, literal judge.
Right, right,
That is someone who has caved to the crowd.
right,
And
right.
this is what these people are protesting. And they said, great, then if it's okay that you all get to basically push the weight around and shift the nature of how the government operates, including the Supreme Court, then we can do that too.
Right.
And what they really made clear, for better or for worse, is that they are much more aggressive and that they're much better at the violence than the
Mm,
progressives are. They're much more experienced at the violence than the progressives are. And the
mm,
progressives don't really understand that, but they're beginning to.
right, right, right.
But in either case, I think that the problem with storming the Capitol is that it
Mm.
only demanded escalation of this entire conversation,
Yeah.
not resolve anything.
Well, and
And
I would
I,
say on a deeper level, the problem is it's almost like a skipping of due process in another way. in that.
That's exactly right. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. Our due
Mhm.
process rights have been violated, so therefore we are going to skip due process ourselves
Right,
and take
right,
it straight to the Capitol. You are absolutely correct. And what
right,
progressives miss is that when you deny us due process, we also can deny you the due process in
right,
whatever way
right,
that we deem. So that's the nature of them not understanding power. When you don't
right, right,
understand economics, you really don't understand power. And if you
right.
have a faulty understanding of economics, you also have a faulty understanding of the nature of power. And at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that their entire motivation is power. But
Right.
if you don't understand the nature of power, there's absolutely no way that you're going to understand economics. And therefore, you're not going to really
Mm,
understand the other side in your opposition. And therefore, you're not being willing to reason with them is only going to backfire on you,
yeah.
which it's doing.
Right. Mm. Wow. It's funny. We got through a lot, and there's still so much to go. I know we
Sorry for
gotta.
yelling.
No, 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 no. You're totally good. Yeah, we'll have to do this again sometimes because we got into a lot, but there's still a lot more there. But I know we've got to wrap it up here in just a second. So, anything else you want to add before we wrap it up today, McCall?
I just want to say that I know that these are literally challenging times on all
Right.
fronts.
Right. Right.
I would encourage people to study from
Right.
as many sources as they can because most available sources have been heavily and highly compromised.
Right.
I would suggest they read older books and older writers.
Right.
I would definitely suggest that people look up the videos from Christopher Hitchens that are
Yeah.
literally prophetic, even though they were recorded 10 and 20 years ago.
Hmm.
Christopher Hitchens was remarkably prophetic in terms of where we are now and how we were getting here.
Right.
And I definitely suggest that you find his videos before they are taken down from YouTube, which I suspect that they ultimately will.
Yeah.
I encourage people to learn about actual economics. I suggest they investigate, organizations like von Mises Institute and even the Jung Institute to understand human nature and psychology,
Yeah.
because those are also great and tried and true resources. But we
Right.
have to get back to fundamental values and beliefs. And I don't mean ideologically speaking, I mean, how do we grow vegetables?
Yeah.
What does capitalism, what happens when I buy something and sell it for a little more and then I
Yeah.
get to pay for my family's food? I'm
Right.
talking about those types of fundamentals.
Yeah.
Understand how that actually works, not what you've been told, in
Right.
your
And
schools.
the principles of due process and why
Correct.
these things are so important.
Correct. And, and,
There's
and and go read
fundamental
the
principles here.
Constitution. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, for
agreed.
sure.
Go back and read the Constitution. And in fact, I'd even say go watch Hamilton.
Right.
I thought Hamilton was absolutely profound
Right. Right.
in terms of its quality, its prescience, and to large part its accuracy in terms of the values and beliefs of the founding fathers and how those beliefs have kind of been distorted now. But I think it's a
Mhm.
great access point to a tremendous amount of American history.
Right.
And I think it's been received well for its entertainment value,
Right. Right.
but I think it needs to also be respected in terms of its value to history and specifically, obviously, to this country. But I think it's a great access point for people who aren't terribly familiar with the history of the country or the characters at play.
All right. That's a lot of homework for us. Maybe we'll do this again after people have had a chance to do some of this homework. Yeah, and we'll keep in touch and probably do this again over the next few weeks. This is gonna be definitely an interesting year, an interesting next few years to say the least. I mean, that's another thing that'd be interesting to get into maybe next time is some predictions of these next few years. I know you talked about it a little bit on the podcast with Boone last month, but these next few years are going to be interesting. So
Indeed, they are.
yeah. All right, McCall. So all right, keep in touch. I know you're going to get another call, but we'll do it again sometimes. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks again. See you next time.
All right, thanks. Have a good one.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye.